we had Ron Jaworski on with us earlier, and he looked at the whole offseason here, and he thinks the Eagles have hired some good coordinators here. There's no question that there was a lot of turmoil at the end of the season going 1-7. And a lot of question marks. And by the way, our good friend Merrill Reese was honest about his assessment. Let's bring Merrill in now and ask him his assessment on what he sees as they move forward here in this offseason. First and foremost, how are you, Merrill?
I'm well, Dan. Good to see you.
All right, Merrill, give us your takeaway from the last 10 days on what you witnessed with the organization. First and foremost, do you believe they're going to right the ship?
Yes. I'm encouraged. I really am encouraged. I think they took two very big steps in adding Vic Fangio and Kellen Moore. I think those are very positive steps.
Would you agree, Merrill, that for you, and even Angelo said this a couple days ago, that Angelo doesn't have a concern with Jalen Hurts at all. He thinks that's the one thing that you can count on the most when it comes to righting the ship and turning what happened at the end of the season down. Are you concerned about him at all, Merrill?
Nope.
Or are you not concerned about him?
Not concerned at all. Not in the least. I think he's one of the great young quarterbacks in this league. I think he will only continue to elevate his play. I think it's a lot about putting him in the right offense, and I thought the offense as a whole last year deteriorated in those last 7 games.
Well, Merrill, I'll ask you then, what do you think was the reason for the collapse?
A lot of things. I think we ignored the fact that they were sliding by early in the season. And I use the word resilience often during those first 11 games, how they kept fighting their way back and how they knew how to win. And they lost that. And when they were beaten by San Francisco, if you remember that game, the very beginning of the game, they marched right downfield and only came away with 3 points. And then they marched, and then they absolutely stymied the 49ers, marched downfield, but again, only came away with 3 points. And from that point on, the field completely tilted. And they were going uphill, and the Niners were going downhill, and it wasn't even a game. And I think the Niners showed some things. They created a template, and everybody else just piled on.
Here's my concern about Nick being back. And you can tell me if you think I'm wrong on this. All year long, Merrill, all year long, he kept saying, don't blame Brian, don't blame Brian, don't blame Brian, don't blame Sean, don't blame Sean. Yet the 2 coaches that got canned were the assistant coaches that he didn't want anyone to blame, and he survives. I mean, how does a coach win 11 ball games, go to the playoffs 3 years in a row, and we're talking about survival? I mean, it just doesn't seem to add up. Merrill is kind of contradicting a little bit that a guy with a record with a 667 win percentage had to have a conversation with the owner about saving his job. It just seemed a little chaotic at the end for me. Am I wrong?
Well, I think the whole season was chaotic at the end. I mean, it ended up chaotic. The first part of the season was fun. The rest of it was awful. And I didn't really have any confidence that they were going to beat the Bucs in Tampa Bay because I thought Nick did the right thing on the final Sunday of the regular season. I was all for playing the regulars because I felt they had to recapture their game. They had to show that they could get it together in time for the playoffs. And when they had that embarrassing performance against the Giants and were trailing 24-0 at halftime before he mercifully pulled the regulars, I knew they were in just deep, deep trouble. And I did not feel confident going into Tampa Bay, and rightfully so. They were terrible that night too. So, yeah, it was a crash landing, no doubt about that. But they move on, and they did what they felt they had to do.
How about this, Merrill? Why such a drastic move when you're going like these coaches they're hiring and these coordinators they're hiring are some of the most experienced coaches that you have in our league. Last year, they hired guys who had very little experience to no experience, and they changed the right. I counted there were 24 guys in new positions last year on last year's staff that were either elevated or new hires. There were 12 of the 24 frontline coaches. Now they've revamped it for 2 years in a row now. Why that change, do you think, that they went from that to this?
Because that didn't work, and hopefully this will. Now, I just want to point out that I think both Sean Desai and Brian Johnson are good men.
Yes.
And coaches, and they will be back, and they will do well. Hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. And I think there's no doubt, looking back, that there is no way they should have made the move by changing defensive coordinators when they did. But then you look at Buffalo, and didn't they change offensive coordinator and then go on a winning streak? So Nick did what he thought he had to do. He showed that he was desperate at that point, and it never worked out because the players were confused in making the change. It did not work out. As far as Brian Johnson was concerned, Nick Sirianni said that was his offense Brian Johnson was running. So the blame doesn't all go on Brian Johnson, and I think he's a bright coach, and I wish both him and Sean well, because they're good men and they're bright football people.
And here's what I'll say about that. I told Raheem this years ago, and Raheem Morris and I have remained friends. He's now the new head football coach of the Atlanta Falcons. And Merrill, I was kind of like a jerk back in the day, but we're better today. I think I'm a little tad bit more mature today. I went like this to Raheem. I go, Raheem, you see this? He goes, yeah, what is it? I go, it's a blank paper. And he goes, yeah. And I go, that's your resume. What makes you think you deserve the head coaching job for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? I go, did you think you were getting fired when you were walking into the offices of the general manager there with Mark Dominic? And he goes, I did. And he ends up having a failure time there, but he learns in other stops in Washington, Atlanta as an assistant with McKay. And then he goes out and becomes the coordinator again. I think sometimes the journey, Merrill, you just have to find the right fit for an assistant coach. Look at Frank. Frank went around to 9 different places. It landed in Philly, and he wins a Super Bowl as a coordinator. So they'll find their spot. I think they're talented people too. Maybe it just wasn't the right place for them at the right time.
I still think Frank is a terrific coach, but
I do too.
He didn't do it in Indianapolis because of things that were out of his control. And I think he was in a bad situation in Carolina where he really didn't have a prayer. And I still think that Ron Rivera is a very good coach. He took the Panthers to the Super Bowl, but then most of the time he suffered with the Daniel Snyder regime in Washington. It's a shame he doesn't have a chance with the Josh Harris, but that's what happens. New owners come in and they want new head coaches. But Ron Rivera is a very, very good football coach.
Well, hey, Merrill, I'll tell you why Frank's not the OC in Philly. There's 38 million reasons. Okay, there's nothing more than that. He's sitting in the beach on Carolina right now, collecting David Tepper's money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, getting him out. I'm like this. I go, so you want to be the coordinator of the Eagles? He goes, would you have to renegotiate your $38 million? I go, I'm not renegotiating anything.
And I don't blame him. But you know what? Doug took a deep breath for a year.
He did.
And got the Jacksonville job, and he's done well. I mean, last year they kind of fell backwards a little bit at the end, but Doug Peterson's a terrific coach, and he'll have Trevor Lawrence and that team playing well next year.
Why are you so confident in Nick Sirianni this coming season, where a lot of people are suspect on him being back? Or how about this, Merrill? I'll say half the room is there's probably a 50-50 side of it right now. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's 50-50. Bring him back, don't bring him back. Why are you confident in bringing him back?
Why don't we say, instead of Nick Sirianni, why don't I say it with this team? I don't want to use the word and say that I'm confident in this team. I'm encouraged in what they've done. I'm encouraged by what they've done. So confident is a different. Last year, going into this season, I was confident that they were going to be a very good team. They should have won the Super Bowl, should have won Super Bowl 57. Okay, they didn't, but they had made some improvements. They had, I thought, a great draft, and I was confident that this team was going to be what I thought they were in the first 10 weeks of the season, first 10, 11 weeks of the season. I thought they were the best team in football at one point, and so did a lot of other people. So going into this season, I felt this. I say I'm from Missouri, show me, but I am encouraged. I am encouraged when you bring in a Fangio and you bring in a Kellen Moore, and I just know how dedicated and how good Jalen Hurts can be. Now they still have to bolster their defense. They still need help at linebacker, and they need help in the secondary. So that's something that there's no doubt they have to improve. But what they've done so far encourages me.
Two last questions for you. Is Howie Roseman, do you think he's getting a pass? And because if he gets the credit for building 22, isn't he accountable? I'm not going to say responsible, Merrill, but isn't he accountable also if we're talking about assistant coaches like Brian Johnson and also Sirianni, that you overestimated maybe Dean's impact that he'll make, maybe some youth and the linebackers that you brought in? It just seemed that they were behind the sticks in a lot of decisions that they made last year. You think he's gotten a pass a little bit?
I don't think he's gotten the pass. I think every general manager in football is accountable. And I think Howie will tell you that he's accountable for everything. And he will tell you that he has a high standard and it wasn't reached by anybody during this past year. But he's done some great things in the past. I thought they had a great draft, didn't you? When they got Jalen Carter, when they moved up to get Jalen Carter, who was probably the best defensive player in the draft. And
I think he is going to be a fabulous ball player. And having gone through what he went through after week 13, it's a common thing. After week 13, 14, all of a sudden, you've never played. And plus, you got to remember something with him also, Merrill. Here's a guy that did a lot of rotating at Georgia, and you've got to get your mentality ready to play. Look at Fletcher. Fletcher had such a good season. And here's a 33-year-old guy that was prepared every single game. Even Milton Williams, I think, is a really fine ball player. And for me, those guys know how to prepare themselves for a long 17-game season. I think both Davis and Carter have to understand it's not just about talent, it's about preparation as well.
Right.
And that's why I think you bring Fletcher Cox back, or you do everything you can, because the importance of having someone like that in the locker room and around those young guys, especially with the equity you've invested, I think he's important to the growth of those guys.
Dan, let me ask you, Fangio's a 30 defense, right? That's his MO. So wouldn't Jordan Davis fit well as a nose tackle?
He will, but what they'll do, he's a control and contain coach. You're going to see a lot of nickel with him, which means 70% of the time you're going to see probably 4 down. So, but what they'll do on first and second, I don't know if they're going to line him up head over the nose, or they're going to shade him on a tilt, or if they're going to play 2 tackles over the tackles, or maybe play again with a 5 front look and a 50 look. I mean, one thing he did in Miami that was great last year, he improved the sack total and broke records. And I tell you what I like about him too, Merrill, is that, I heard a lot of guys down in Miami bitching about him. Good. I don't want anybody really loving my D coordinator. I want them playing for him.
Yeah.
And don't worry about whether you like him, whether or not you're doing right by him. And so I think the question mark for me will be who's playing Mike linebacker, and how are the safeties going to be, and how are you going to utilize Sidney? And I was telling everybody earlier on Sidney fitting in Vic Fangio's system. He's a very aggressive kid. I mean, a super aggressive kid, the way he tackles, the way he runs to the ball.
Love him.
I do too, but are they going to be aggressive, or are they going to stay schematically the same, control and contain, dump underneath? That's been a mantra of his. By the way, just so you know, Merrill, he recruited me in 1981 when he was in high school, and he was at Milford Academy. I went up there. My high school coach goes, "Don't you remember Vic Fangio recruiting you and bringing you up to Milford?" I went, "No." He goes, "You sat right in front of him. You were 18 years old." I'm like, "Get out of here." You went to North Carolina after that. So I've always been a fan of the guy. I just think it's going to be interesting to see what kind of pieces they give him and how much influence he has on the draft.
Yeah, I think both Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio are going to have maximum input.
You think so? You think they will have say in the but because look at the assistant coaches they're bringing in.
I don't mean to say that they're going to be picking players,
right?
But I think they're going to be heavily consulted.
Well, this is I told everyone this is how coaches, NFL guys don't sit around watching a guy playing against North Carolina and Vanderbilt. What they do is they tell the personnel guys, "This is a profile player I want. A guy like a Derek Brooks, a guy like a Ryan Shazier, somebody like that has a skill set like that can play off the ball, can play on the ball, can fill gap, can cover tight ends, is really recognizable on getting running backs." So to me, that's the kind of profile. Whatever that name is on the back of the jersey, Merrill, the assistant coaches don't know what that name is yet. They're just looking for that fine guy. Howie and his people go out and they kind of funnel it down to 5 guys and they go, "Here's the 5 guys." They put them on tape. Which guy do you think best fits your skill set? Then they go from there.
Well, it'd be nice if they say, "Let's find the Micah Parsons."
I'll tell you what, man. I'd rather have them say, "Let's find a Seth Joyner."
I'm okay with that too.
Merrill, thank you so much, my friend. I mean, it's always an honor to get you on here, and I can't thank you enough.
My pleasure, Dan. It's always good to be on with you. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you so much. The great Merrill Reese. We appreciate him coming aboard, folks. Absolutely fantastic. We appreciate him stepping in there with us. Please hit the like button. Keep it here on the National Football Show.